Hi. So in this video, I want to show you how you can leverage Pydantic models or data classes in Python when you are essentially connecting with a relational database like Postgres. And I'm not going to use ORMs. I'm not going to get into why I don't use and don't like ORMs. And mainly it's because I know SQL very well. I'm very comfortable with it. It makes total sense for me. It's very well tailored for relational databases. ORMs, I feel, are not. They're more tailored for your code, right? For your object notations, things like that. And so I found, however, that I prefer working with SQL. And I also do not have a problem of this, something that's called an impedance mismatch, where the data in a relational database is essentially just rows of tuples, right? You can think of it as rows of tuples. And so when you connect and you query and you return data from your Postgres database into Python, you get rows of tuples as well. And now you've got to put that into objects if you want to use objects, which is going to be fairly typical, right? In other languages as well, like Java. We don't typically use data structured as a tuple because you have to remember the positional index of everything. We want objects, that have field names, right? And then we can access the fields from our database, right, from our table, using the field name in Python. It makes it much easier to work with. So I'm going to show you that you can actually get rid of this impedance mismatch. You can have your data that's coming back out of your SQL table into an actual Python object. Could be a data class, could be a Pydantic model. It can also just be a plain dictionary too, if that's what you prefer doing. All right, so with that, there's really going to be three steps here. One is I need to run Postgres. So I'm going to show you a very quick and dirty way of running Postgres locally using Docker. So of course, you're going to need to install Docker on your machine. Then I'm going to show you how I basically set up the tables that we're going to work with in this video in my database. And I'm going to use a migration tool. Migrations are basically ways in which you can define what the database structure should be. So you can issue commands like create table or drop table, or you can, maybe create foreign keys or indexes, things like that. And all those can be done by issuing SQL commands, right? What are called data definition language, DDL commands. And one of the things that you really want to be able to do is to capture those commands in your Git, in a version control system. Here I'm using Git, right? And I need to be able to keep track of that. You want to be able to know how your database was created and how it evolved over time. If you just go in directly, let's say you're using Microsoft SQL Server and you use SQL Enterprise Manager, sure, you can use the GUI there to create tables and do all that kind of stuff. But if you, let's say, lose that table for some reason or other, or you have to restore somewhere else, how do you recreate that table? Well, you really need that code, right? That create table statement that you can then reuse. So this is what SQL migrations are actually very good for. And I use a tool called YoYo. Some people, especially those that use SQLAlchemy, which remember, I don't, out of choice. I do not use ORM, so I don't use SQLAlchemy, but one of the tools there that's very often used with SQLAlchemy is Alembic, and the idea is essentially the same. YoYo is just completely independent, and it can handle, I think, Postgres, MySQL, SQLite. I think those are the three kind of connectors that it has, and you may be able to do more as well, I'm not sure. So that's the second step. And then the third step is going to be actually querying data and seeing how we can put that data into data classes or dictionaries or Pydantic models. So let's get started. The first thing that I did is I created an empty directory called data. And I also have an empty directory called migrations. This is where our migrations are going to end up. The things that will modify the database, create tables, and create indexes, those kinds of things. They will go in that. And as you can see, it's part of my project, so it's going to be included in my Git structure. Data is really just going to be a way for me to persist the data that I'm putting into my Postgres database. Because remember, that's going to be running in Docker. And I want to be able for my database to survive restarts of that container. So I'm going to create this folder here. It's going to have essentially all the data that's needed to run that Postgres database in that container. And then we'll get to whatever the examples are and so on. The other thing too is that we're going to need a few libraries. So the ones that I'm going to use here for this video is going to be Pydantic, YoYo Migrations, which is that YoYo migration tool, and then we also need psycopg, which is the library that we use to connect to Postgres. And we're going to install it from binary. If you don't do that, then you can certainly do it, but you'll need to make sure that you have all the prerequisites for compiling psycopg on your machine. And very often when it's on Windows, it's a much more complicated thing to do. So here I'm just installing from binary. The other thing too is for the YoYo tool. So I've already done this, right? So I've created my Python environment. I'm using Python 3.12. I've already installed these packages in my virtual environment. The other thing that we need is to get YoYo set up, right? So it's going to need to know where are the migration files located, which database is it connecting to. I'll come back to this. And there's other things that you can configure as well. Those are the two main ones. So let's take a look at the Docker Compose. Very, very, bare bones kind of Docker Compose file. I've got the Postgres service. I'm using this image in Alpine Postgres 16. And then I map the port. So the default port for Postgres is 5432. That's in the container. And I'm mapping it to port 5432 on my system, on the host system. If you've got contention where you've got something else using that, just change your port mappings. It doesn't really matter. This volume here is what I was telling you about. I'm basically mapping this folder here to the data folder that's located here in the container. And that's what Postgres uses to persist itself, right? As you create tables and insert or delete data, everything gets tracked in here. And then we need some environment variables. Here I'm using the Postgres password, user, and DB environment variables to specify the admin user, the password for the admin user, and what my default database should be. Now, obviously, this is definitely not how you would do things in production, right? Never put secrets in your code that's going to get version controlled. You can't do that. So this isn't the way you would do that for production. But for local development, well, I don't care, right? All this stuff is living on my machine, and then somebody else that's using this, well, that will also be on their machine. Having this secret over here is not a big deal. All right, so once we have this Docker Compose file, all we need to do is open up a terminal and start up the services in the Docker Compose. To do that, and there's only one here, right, Postgres. So to do that, we do Docker Compose up. Now, if we do Docker Compose up, it's actually going to just keep running. It's going to take over the terminal. It will keep running, and we'll see the logs coming in. I don't want to do that. I just want to start up the services and then come back to my terminal. So for that, I use the -d for the daemon flag. And everything looks like it worked, right? So it created the network by default. I didn't specify a specific network here. And then it went ahead and started the container. Now, you can always check to see if your container is running. So you can say docker compose ls, and you can see that we have this container over here, and it is running. If you want to see the logs, then it's pretty straightforward as well. You can say docker compose logs Postgres, and then we can just follow it as well. Postgres -f to follow the logs, and you get those logs being followed. All right, and then I'll Control C to cancel out of that, but you would see the logs coming through. Okay, so that was the first step, right? And by the way, all this code, everything is in the Git repo, right? So you don't have to necessarily be able to read this here on the screen. I can certainly make it bigger, but then it becomes difficult to see everything at once, okay? But essentially, this is the code for the Docker Compose file. That is quite straightforward. So now the next thing we need to do is to look. Now we have this database up and running. So I'm going to use the tool that comes with my PyCharm, which is the, it's not the community edition, this is the professional version. So it comes with a database tool where you can connect to databases and run queries and do all kinds of stuff. Obviously, if you do not have the paid version of PyCharm, you're going to have to use some other tool. There's tools like dbeaver, which I think is cross-platform. And then you have tools that are specific, you know, that will only run on Windows, things like that. You can even, if you're using Postgres, you can even use their admin UI as well. But here, I just like using it in PyCharm. I've got everything that I need in one single kind of window, right? So what I need to do is I need to connect to the data source. So you'll notice that the data source is on my local host. It's going to be at port 5432, and this is the admin user, the admin password, and the database. Now, if we go back to the YoYo ini file, by the way, while we're at it, you'll see that that's exactly what I've specified here for my database connection. So I specified that this is Postgres SQL using the psycopg library to connect to it. There are other ways of connecting. And then I have the username and password at the system, which, you know, you can put an IP address, but here it's my local host, so I can just use localhost as the name, / the name of the database and the port that it's running on. So this basically is how we can configure YoYo. Now you can also do it without an INI file, and you just have to then specify that every time whenever you invoke YoYo on the command line. I don't want to do that, so I create this INI file. Okay, so we've got YoYo configured to talk to our database. Now I need to do the same thing here so I can actually see what's going on in the database. So I'm going to add a new data source. It's going to be a Postgres. So I'm going to do Postgres. And here I just need to specify where it is. So it's localhost port 5432. That's good. I don't have to change anything there. We're using user and password authentication. The username was admin. The password was secret. And the database I had called mathbyte. If you don't specify a database, then it will default to Postgres as the database name. Okay, so I can test my connection. Everything worked, so that means that my server, my Postgres server, is actually running in that container, in that Docker container, and I can talk to it from my host. Okay, so that's it. And I left the name of that connection as that. You can change it to whatever you want. So here's our database, mathbyte. So if we look at the public schema, you'll notice that it's empty. There's nothing in there. And yeah, that seems fair, right? We just created the database. There shouldn't be anything there. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to start creating tables. And I'm going to use YoYo for that. So YoYo is going to maintain a few tables actually in our database to know exactly where it's at. Because the way migrations work is that you write, over time, you write statements, SQL statements, that modify the structure of the database. And at any point in time, you may have statements that haven't been executed against the database yet, right? And so YoYo needs to be able to keep track of the files that you have in your migrations folder compared to what you have in the database. And that's this versioning kind of, thing that we have going on. So in order to create a migration with YoYo, we need to create files in here, but we don't create them by hand. What we do is we actually use the command line. So what I'm going to do is to create a new migration. So I'm going to type, and let me make that a little bit bigger. So I'm going to type and say YoYo new. So I'm creating a new migration, and what did I do? I hit something. Okay, new. I'm going to use the -m, and this is going to allow me to give a meaningful name to the migration file. So the migration file that YoYo is going to create is going to contain things like the date in it and things like that, so it can keep track of what those files are and the order in which to apply them. There's other ways that it does that as well. We'll see that. But it's also good to give it some kind of name as well. So I'm going to call this one dbinit. Okay. So let's go ahead and hit enter. And it created the migration file. If we refresh here, you'll see that we now have this file over here that ends with dbinit, which was that dbinit that I specified here, right? But it's got some other stuff as well that YoYo uses internally. If we look at the file, then you'll see that it basically just does some Python, and then in here is where you're going to specify your SQL code, right? And there's different ways you can create these migration files with different syntax for the files. Here, I just happen to like this particular option. Take a look at the YoYo documentation. You can have pure SQL, and then it can do a lot more, right? Here it's going to use transactions, obviously, but those are implicit. So I don't have to worry about, opening or starting and committing or rolling back transactions. YoYo will take care of that for me. If you need more control, you certainly can, right? I'm not going to get into that here. So it created this migration file, which is essentially empty, and it also has this very important field here called depends. This is how YoYo knows the order in which migrations have to be applied to the database. And right now, this depends is empty because this is the first migration. So nothing's dependent, right? It doesn't depend on anything before it. Okay, so the first thing I want to do now that I've got this migration here is I want this migration to create a table. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to specify my steps this way. No, come on, don't autocomplete on me. Really? Autocomplete is nice, and then sometimes it really just gets in the way. Okay. So each step in the migration is essentially going to be a SQL statement or a set of SQL statements that are going to be run by YoYo against our database. So what do we want to do here? Well, I want to create a table. I want to create a table called employee. So I'm going to say create table, and I'm going to call it employees or employee, depends on which, whether you want to use plural or singular. I'm going to use singular here. My first one is I want to create an ID column, which is going to be a serial. So it's going to increment automatically. It's going to be kind of an integer that auto increments. Then I want it to be a primary key. So I want this to be also the primary key for the table. And let me put that on a different line like so. Okay, so we've got the ID. What else do I want in here? Well, I want the first name, which I'm going to make into a text field. And by the way, you don't have to capitalize these things. I actually usually do not. But I thought for this video, maybe I should, because I think a lot of people do. So I want the first name to be a text field, and I don't want it to be nullable. So I can also specify not null, right? Then I can do last name, and we'll make it text as well. Actually text uppercase, and then not null also. And then maybe I'm going to want a nickname, and that's going to be text. And I am going to allow that one to be nullable, so I'm not going to specify the not null constraint. I also want to have a department. And for the department, I want it to be a text field. So this is an employee. Employees are going to be in departments like maybe, engineering or R&D and HR and marketing, whatever it is, the department name. And I'm going to make it text, and I do not want it to be nullable. So I'm going to make it not null as well. Okay. So that's how I create my table. So if I was to run this YoYo migration, it would look in the database, see that nothing was ever run. Remember, this is still empty at this point. So YoYo realizes that, oh, you've never run anything using YoYo with this database. So I'm going to start from scratch. It will install its tables in our database, and it will also create this table. That's called rolling forward. That's called applying the migration. But I also want the option to roll back the migration. So let's say that I apply this migration. It's going to create the employee table, but I wanted the ability to roll back. I can issue a command in YoYo saying rollback. But YoYo needs to know, how do I roll back? It doesn't. So this is what the second element of the step is. The second argument of the step is, how do you roll back? Well, in this case, how do I roll back creating the employee table? I just drop the table, and auto completion has it for me right here. And this is also in part because I'm using Copilot, right? So it's doing a lot more. And I'll probably do a video on Copilot. If you're interested in that, let me know in the comments. And if there's enough people requesting it, if somebody's already asked for it, you can just use the thumbs up to indicate that you're interested in me doing a video on how to use Copilot AI within Pydantic. I've been using it for a little while now, trying to see how well it works. And frankly, I'm very impressed with it. Anyways, before I digress too much. So the rollback is just drop the table, right? So I have a single step here in this migration. I could have multiple steps. You could do more. I'm not going to do any here. I'll just have a single step. I'll show you migrations later where we can do multiple steps. The roll forward, create the employee table. The roll back, drop the employee table. And that's it. That's our migration, right? Now, what we can do is with YoYo, we have, let's say, the list command. So if I do YoYo list, you'll see that it tells us that it found this migration over here, which is, this is the name, right? And this was the file name that we had over here. The source, well, it's coming from this migrations folder. And the status is U. It hasn't been applied. It's unapplied. So there's two statuses here. U for unapplied and A for applied. So here it's saying, oh, it hasn't been applied. Now I want to apply it. I want to apply it. Now remember, YoYo's been configured to talk to this mathbyte database. So all I need to do is just say YoYo apply, and it will apply all the migrations that exist. At this point, there's only one. So you can see that it went through it and it applied, right, this migration. So now if we go to public, and now if we refresh, then we're going to have a few more things. You can see that we have our employee table. Our employee table, I don't know if I can make this bigger. Zoom IDE, let's make it 175. Okay, that's maybe a little more reasonable. Okay, so as you can see, we have our tables here that were created by YoYo, and that basically allows it to figure out where it's at. Because now if I do a YoYo list, then you'll see that it's changed, right? The status has changed to applied. It knows that it already applied this migration. So if I was to say YoYo apply again, it's going to come back and essentially do nothing because it knows it's already applied that particular migration. Now, let's say I decided that that's not what I wanted, right? I want to roll back. So I haven't committed this code yet, right? It hasn't been pushed out to production because once things get pushed out to production, you do not want to modify existing migrations. You want to modify structure in your database by creating new migrations, not by changing existing migrations. You will break everything potentially if you do that. Here, I'm still in development mode. So I may decide like, oh, that's not what I wanted to do. So I can just issue a rollback. And so YoYo is going to look at, okay, what's the current latest migration you're on? Roll back one migration. It will roll back one migration at a time. Here, there's only one right now. So I'll do a rollback. And if we now refresh public tables again, you'll notice the employee table is gone because it was dropped. All right, so I've decided that, no, actually I'm happy, right? I'm not going to change anything there. Or maybe I changed something. Maybe I'd forgotten to make department not null. Now I'm ready to reapply the migration, YoYo apply, and we're back to where we started. We now have the employee table, which is back. Now, we can also roll back to a specific version if you want to with YoYo. All you need to do is just to specify this thing over here. So if we do a YoYo list, right, you'll notice the ID here, which is really just the file name minus the PY. We can actually tell YoYo to roll back a specific or to and including a specific migration. So all you need to do is just say roll back, and then you'd say -R to specify which one, and then we'll do this one over here. So I'm just going to copy paste this code over here. Now there's only one migration right now, so it's not very useful to do that. But there you go, it's done that, it's done the rollback. If we look, our employee table is gone again. All right, so I'm going to go back to YoYo apply, and we should get our table back. Okay, so that was that. Okay, so let's say that this migration actually made it out in production. It was, added to our Git repo. It's been versioned, it's been committed, all that stuff. And now, let's say, a week later, I'm sitting here and it's like, you know what? I do not want to use employee. I don't want to use the singular for my table name. I'm going to use the plural, for example. Well, as I said, the last thing you want to do is to go back and modify the existing migration. Once it's been pushed out, right, you don't touch it again. So what do I need to do? I need to create a new migration. So in this case, I'm going to create a new migration. I'm going to say YoYo new. And what do I want to call this? Well, I'm going to call it rename employee table, right? That's what I want to do. I want to rename the employee table. I usually try and keep my migrations to do one specific task. I would rather have multiple migrations than have a single migration that does, umpteen tasks, because then you can't roll back individual pieces if you need to. And I prefer keeping things very focused. Just like in Python, when you write functions, functions should have a single thing that they're doing, right? They shouldn't be trying to do everything under the sun. They need to be pretty well self-contained. That's how you write functional code. Well, this is kind of the same deal here. Okay, so now I've got a second migration that's been created, right? Here's the second migration here. And if we look at the contents of it, you'll see that apart from just the date that's in there, you also have this depends, right? And this depends is saying that this migration, this current migration here, that I haven't written yet, comes after this migration over here, which was the first one. And again, this is something you do not want to touch, right? You can, of course, but you really need to know what you're doing to not break things. So the safest thing is don't touch it. The only thing you should be touching is the step over here. Okay, so the step here is actually pretty straightforward. What do I want to do? I want to rename the employee table to employees. So all I need to do for that is to say alter table, and look at that, my auto completion comes right in. Alter table employee rename to employees. Yep, that's exactly the SQL statement that I want, right? And we'll close that off, and I don't know what it's doing over there. But that's not the only statement that I want in my step. Remember, I want to be able to roll back. So what is my rollback here? I've changed my table from employee to employees. What's the rollback? Well, I need to do rename from employees to employee. That's the rollback. Happens to be also what I have under the auto completion here. But I can also just type it or let it autocomplete that way. I'm not sure why it's putting squigglies. Oh, it's putting squigglies because it doesn't, finish off the string properly. Okay, and that's it. That's my roll forward and roll back. So now again, if I do YoYo list, you'll see that I have one applied migration and then this one is not applied. How do I apply it? YoYo apply. It will apply all the unapplied migrations. And now if I look at the database, you'll notice that if I refresh, we now have employees now in the plural form, right? And again, I can roll it back. I can say YoYo roll back, and it will roll it back to employee, if I spell it right. So if we refresh, now it's employee. If I roll forward again, YoYo apply, okay, it will bring it forward. Okay, so that's one migration that we did to rename the table. Now, I want to do a few more. I actually want to create sample data, right? So I want to be able to add sample data to my employee table. Now, typically, you use migrations to maybe populate tables with data that is fixed. Maybe it's like lookup values for something or other, right? What I'm about to do here is a little out of the ordinary. You wouldn't necessarily, use migrations to populate sample data, but I don't want to go ahead and write, a Python connector to then connect to the database, do the inserts. We'll look at that maybe later. Right now, all I'm going to do is I'm actually going to use a migration to do that. So I'm going to do a YoYo new, and I'm going to call this generate sample employee data, right? So once more, we have a new file over here, right? That one, which is the new migration. And for my migration, I'm going to just copy paste this from the repo. So I don't have to retype this because I just basically made up some bogus data. And wow, things don't, there we go. So I'm basically doing an insert statement. So I'm inserting into the employees table the following values. You can see that nickname is sometimes null, sometimes populated. And then the rollback is what? Well, my roll forward was insert data into an empty table. So what should be my rollback? Well, delete everything from that table. So that's the rollback that I have for that step. So now I can say YoYo apply. It's going to run that. And if we go to our database and we look at the employees, so let me refresh that to show that it's employees, double click on it, you can see that we now have data in our database. That was actually inserted by the YoYo migration. Okay, so now this has been pushed out, let's say to production, it's been committed, and I realized that, wait a minute, I don't like this department just being plain text. I really want this to be linked to a department table, and I want this department column here to become a department ID that is a foreign key based on the primary key of the department table, which will have an ID just like this table here has a single ID, which was a serial. We'll do the same thing for a department table. So this is getting a little bit more complex. So let's go ahead and actually use a migration to do that. So let's go back to looking at this, minimizing that. Well, I don't need that. So anyways, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to make another YoYo migration. So YoYo new -m, and I'm going to say this change departments to foreign key, right? So that's what I want to do. Okay, so it's created the migration. Again, right, change departments to foreign key depends on the previous one, which was the generate sample employee data. Sample employee data itself comes after rename the employee table, which itself comes after the DB init, okay? So what do we want to do for this migration? Well, the first thing is I want to create the departments table. So again, I'm just going to copy paste this so we don't have to retype it here. But the roll forward is create a table called departments, make an ID, serial primary key, and the name, just plain text. And it's not nullable because I'm not specifying not null. And then what's the rollback for that? Well, it's drop table, right? So I could leave my migration at that and then create a new migration and so on. But this is kind of one step, right? So what I'm doing here is kind of a single thing, right? I need to create a department foreign key. I need to change that department string to be a department ID, which is then a foreign key into the departments table. So for me, it makes sense to have multiple steps now in this particular migration. Okay, so what's the second thing that I need to do? Well, if you think about what's going to happen, I have this employees table, right, that has this department as text. I've just created a new departments table. It's not in the database yet because I haven't applied. I could say YoYo apply, right? So now we'll see that we have the departments table as well, right? But of course it's going to be empty at this point. But I'm not done. So I'm going to do the YoYo rollback because I'm not done with modifying my migration right now, okay? I'm still in the process of developing it. So what do I want to do? Well, I want to take all the unique departments that are in the employees table. So if we look, right, we have physics, mathematics, drama, English, lit, but they occur multiple times. So I want to take those values and make an entry for each unique one, for each distinct value of department in the departments table, and it will automatically assign an ID to it. So that's my next step. So what I'm going to do is go back to my migration, and in here, I'm going to add another step that's going to come after it's created the table. And what do I want to do? Well, I want to select all the distinct departments from the employees table, and I want to insert that into the departments table under the name field. Now, what's the rollback from that? Well, I have to delete from the departments anything that I inserted, because remember, after this has rolled forward, the next step is to insert data. So if we want to roll back that step, we just need to delete the data. And if we roll back this step over here, that will actually drop the table. So that's the second step. Now that's great, but what do I still want to do? Well, to the employees table, I want to add a department ID column. I actually want to replace department with department ID, but I can't quite do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a column called department ID. So let me go ahead and add that step in. So the step is going to be this one over here. We're going to alter our table and we're going to add a column called department ID, which is going to be an integer. And then we're going to do the rollback, which is what? Well, it's just drop that new column that we created, right? So that's our next step. Now, what else do I want to do? Well, I need now to populate this particular column, right? So if I roll this forward, let me go ahead and say YoYo apply. So if we do that, and if we look at the employees table, right, we should have a new column here, which is department ID. I really want this to be a foreign key to the department table, which is over here now. It's been populated, right? So however, I cannot yet at this point specify that department ID should be a foreign key yet, because they're all null values and I don't have, right, that's not going to work. So I'm going to keep setting the foreign key relationship to later in the migration. For now, what do I need to do? Well, the next step is I actually need to go look at the departments table and figure out what the ID is for each department, right? And then populate that inside the department ID column. So I need to go back here and look up physics. Well, physics is what? It's ID number 2. And then I need to basically pop in here 2 for here, 2 for here, 1 for math, and so on. So we need to go back to our migration and do basically a SQL statement to do that. And again, that is very straightforward. So I'm going to copy paste that. And what we're doing here is we're updating the employees table from the departments table. So we're going to do the lookup. Here's where we decide which department we're using. It's in the where clause, right? Where employees.department equals departments.name, because that's what we called it in the departments table. And then we're going to grab the ID from the departments table and use that to populate the department ID column, right? Again, this is just very plain, straightforward SQL. By the way, if you want to learn SQL, I strongly suggest you do so. If you're going to be in a data analysis or data engineering field, you need to learn SQL. If you want me to do videos on that, let me know. I set up a poll recently and there's very little interest in SQL. So I'm probably not going to make videos on SQL unless I start seeing some, a lot of requests for it. And yeah, so I'm not sure why there isn't any interest in SQL. Is it that you guys don't use SQL for some reason or other, or you just don't because you don't need to? You're not doing a lot of data engineering or a lot of work with databases? Or is it because you just try and avoid SQL as much as you can and then use these, ORMs, which, of course, as you know, I don't like. So I'm just curious, why no interest in SQL? If you got some viewpoints on that, let us know in the comments. It'd be interesting to know. Anyways, so this is what we're doing. Now, how do we roll back that step? Well, we just set the department ID to null, right? That's how we roll back that particular step. So now that we have that, let's go ahead and actually do that. So let's do YoYo apply. And if we look at the employees table now, oops, what happened? Didn't populate or? Oh, maybe, you know what? I don't think I did the rollback. So I need to do the YoYo rollback. Then I need to do YoYo apply. I think I forgot to do the rollback. So when I was applying, well, there was nothing to apply, I think. So let's go back, take a look at the employees table once more. And yeah, as you can see, the department ID now has been updated. Okay, so I'm almost there. What do I still need to do to, finish up the work that I need to do here? Well, I need to drop the department column. I don't need that anymore, right? So that one is actually very straightforward to do in the roll forward. Let's go ahead and do the migration, and I'll explain what's going on in the migration, in the step. So the step here, moving forward, is just drop the column. Now, moving back is not that straightforward, because moving back, to do a rollback, I have to reinsert that column, and then I have to populate it as well. So here, my step actually contains two SQL statements. One is add the column back to the table, and then update the employees table by grabbing the department name using the department ID column, which remember now is populated in our table here. I have the department ID. So moving forward, we've dropped the department column. Now what's the last thing that I want to do? Well, I want to make a foreign key relationship. I want to make sure that when the department ID is specified in the employees table, it actually maps to an ID in the departments table. So for that, one final step that we're going to do here, and the roll forward step is just to create the constraint. So we're going to alter table employees, we're going to add a constraint, we'll give it a name, foreign key employees to department, and we specify that it is a foreign key type of constraint based on the department ID, which is in the employees table, and that it should reference the ID field or column in the departments table. And then the rollback, of course, is very simple. We just drop that constraint. So that basically completes that migration. So as you can see, this migration is fairly involved. It's doing a lot of things, but you can see that we have code to do all that. So it's going to be in our Git repo. We can version it, we can roll forward, we can roll back. And if ever we want to create a new database, right, elsewhere, all we need to do is to essentially connect up YoYo using the INI file to a different database and just apply all the migrations. And it will do that happily. So I'm going to do YoYo rollback because I think it was applied, right? If I do YoYo constraint doesn't, yeah, because, okay, I'm going to do YoYo apply, but this is why I was saying you got to be careful about doing roll forwards and roll backs, because now what am I doing here? I'm trying to drop this constraint that doesn't exist. So let's say, I think I can just say if exists, like so. So because I can't apply this migration. It's already been applied. Now I'm trying to roll it back and it's saying, well, you want to drop this constraint, but it doesn't exist. This is why I'm getting this error over here, right? If I do a YoYo list, you can see everything's been applied. So I need to basically fix things so I can actually roll back. I should have rolled back and I forgot to do that before making all these migration steps. And you know, I'm just going to, this worked by the way, but I really don't want to put that in my code because I wanted to error out if that constraint already exists, because it shouldn't. So I'm going to comment out all the stuff that I did, which was, I think, from here on. So I'm just going to comment that out temporarily, do a YoYo rollback. Okay, so we're good. Then I'm going to uncomment all that stuff. And now I'm going to do my YoYo apply. Okay, so, and let's just test that we can do the rollback again. That's working, good. So let's apply it again. Let's make sure that everything now looks fine in our database. So if we refresh that, you can see that we have now just the department ID. That's all that table has, just the department ID. We've got our departments, everything's good. Now, can we roll back to this one over here? Remember that I told you that you can specify which migration you want to roll back to, right? And of course it will include that migration. So if we do a YoYo list, just to get the names of the migrations, then the one that I want to roll back to maybe is this one, right? So I want to go back to, let's say it was like a blank database. So YoYo rollback -r and that. And it should basically have applied all these rollbacks. So if we look now at our database, we should see that we have nothing. There's no employees table, no departments table. And then we can just say YoYo apply, and it will run, remember, all the migrations that haven't been applied yet. So it runs through all the migrations, and now we're back to where we ended just now, where our employees table is populated with sample data, the department ID is now a foreign key, it's been created, added in, and so on. Okay, so that's how to set up Postgres locally on your machine, and that is how to use YoYo to do migrations. So I think I'm going to break the video here because it's probably already fairly long. And in the next video, I am going to show you now how we can connect to Postgres using psycopg and how we can leverage data classes or Pydantic or dictionaries if we want to basically map those records from this employee table or the departments table or any query that we run into actual Python objects. And of course, all without using an ORM. All right, thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.